lips, Almighty God, that I may worthily proclaim your gospel and keep it. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt becomes tasteless, what can make it salty again? It is good for nothing and can only be thrown out to be trampled underfoot by people. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hilltop cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp to put it under a tub. They put it on the lampstand where it shines for everyone in the house. In the same way, your light must shine in the sight of all, so that seeing your good works, they may give the praise to your Father in heaven." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Lord Jesus. Gospel wipe away our sins. I'm reminded of a little anecdote of a teacher in a classroom, a science class this was. The teacher was just finishing a science class at the fag end of school, right at the end of the day, 3 o'clock or 3:30 it was. It was just 5 minutes for the bell when this teacher asked the class, "Have you any questions? Any more questions? Any more questions?" Now in our boys' school, we never liked anyone asking a question at that time. You ask a question before the bell means you whack the fellow or do something like that. And yet one fellow put his hand up and said, "I've got a question." And all the other guys looked at him, can imagine how. And he said, "I've got a question." "Okay, what's your question?" And his question was this. He said, Teacher, in a science class, what is the meaning of life?" You can imagine the other fellows must have got wild. And what is the meaning of life? Now this teacher was a sensible woman. And she looked at him and she tried to check whether he really wanted to know. And once she deciphered that he really wanted to know and he was genuine, she said, "Okay, I'll tell you what is the meaning of life." So wait for a moment. She put her hand in her purse or her bag and pulled out a piece of mirror. Not this big, a piece of mirror. And said, "Look at this. I found this years ago when I was a little girl. Far away in that little town where I came from, we were rather poor as a family. We were of little means, scarce means. And one day as I was walking on the road, I saw a number of pieces of mirror strewn on the road, probably from some broken motorcycle reflector or something, mirror. And so she said, I tried to gather all the pieces, I couldn't. But I wanted something. So I took the biggest piece. It was about this big. And then I sharpened it by scraping the sides against a rock, and I made it nice and round and more or less round and curved on the edges, and I kept it with me. And then I started playing games with it, like some of us did. We look at the light of the sun and reflect the sun's light onto different people's faces or in dark corners or onto something which is dark and does not have light. So she said I'd start playing like that, reflecting the light especially into dark corners. And then she said, as I grew up into being a young girl, into a young woman, I realized that this little game, what was a game for me as a little child, could well turn out to be for me a metaphor for how I ought to live my entire life. And she said, this became for me a way of life. I felt called to be this kind of person who reflects light onto others, particularly in places which need light, dark corners of the world. Now, what is this light? You can take a guess. It can be different things. God's light, or the light of truth, the light of understanding, the light of goodness, the light of positivity, the light of forgiveness. The light is there. The light was always there. But she said, I felt called to be able to attract some of this into my own life and to pass it on to people who needed this life probably the most. This, she said, was the metaphor. It became for me a metaphor for life. This is precisely what today's gospel is telling us. It's saying, you are light. You are meant to be reflectors of God's light. You are meant to cultivate a presence that is radiant, that lights up the world, that presence of generosity, of tenderness, of kindness. Pope Francis talks of a revolution of kindness, a revolution of mercy. This is something of that. Now, how are we to be reflectors of God's light? So many ways. I want to put forth just 3 simple attitudes which can help us be people who can cultivate this kind of a radiating presence. 3 simple attitudes, there can be millions. The first attitude is this, which can help us be radiators of light. And I like it this way. This was by Fulton Sheen, a famous American archbishop. He says, all of us are called to be wasteful. So the first attitude is this, be wasteful. And he qualifies this. He says, what does it mean to be wasteful? Not to waste away, but to use up and to waste all the gifts and capacities and talents that we have onto others and for the sake of those who need it. Now, one day when I was talking to one of our Jesuits, and when they heard of this, be wasteful, some of our Jesuits are quite nutty. Also, one fellow said, to be wasteful means for some of us to be full around the waist. Not that wasteful, to be wasteful, to waste away, to use up all that God has blessed us with for the sake of others. Just being here in the shrine, I think of the people who started this place. If you know of the history of Swami Shila Chandra, he was called, Father Peter Lewis, the pains he took to be able to just foster a devotion which was already beginning among people, and facilitating travel between Bombay and here, starting a special train, trying and collecting funds, doing outreach, helping people in the districts. That's what the shrine does even today. With much of what comes in, helping district boardings, all of our districts, in Tiloli and Shirpur and Nandurbar, Manor, all over, mostly in our tribal areas. He thought of this, but he used up all his energies. There were so many who used up. There was another Father Barranco, and some of you who are from Nasik will know. He started a massive watershed program, not very far from here, in Gangapur Road and somewhere there. In fact, he died very young of a motorcycle accident. But in the few years that he lived, till his early 40s or so, he kind of used up so many of his energies in starting something massive for the farmers of Nasik. To be wasteful. We are called, I think this is what we are called to use up all our gifts before we die. Many of you will have heard of that book, Die Empty. Rather recent, 1 or 2 years old. It's a book by Todd Henry called Die Empty. You know what Die Empty means? He begins this little part by asking the question, which do you think is the richest area on earth? What do you think is the richest piece of ground on earth, the richest piece of land on earth, or the most expensive land, or the most priceless piece of land? And different people said different things, gold mines, or where you get diamonds, or where you get whatever else. And he says no. In the end, he says the richest piece of land on earth, I think, is the cemetery, the graveyard. Of course, this is an extreme answer, because he says all of us take so many of our talents to the grave. Now, it's not humanly possible to use all our talents before we die, sure. But he says, before you die, make sure you use up for the benefit of people whatever you can use up of what God has given you. That he calls dying empty. Before you die, make sure you empty yourself of the goodness in you. Okay, a second attitude. So the first one, be wasteful. Not W-A-S-T-E, remember. The second, remember, you are only a vessel and not the source. In trying to be a reflector of God's light, remember, you are only a channel. We are only vessels. We are not the source. The light is already there. God is already there. Goodness abounds. It's all over. But we are called to mediate. We are called to be able to take in some of that goodness and to be able to reflect it onto people. We don't have to do everything. We cannot do everything. I think of that that famous novel in Spanish, no? Don Quixote. You've heard of Don Quixote, man of La Mancha, who wanted to right all the wrongs of the world. He became a bit of an eccentric guy, and he said, I want to conquer all evil and be the best person, and to do good all over. We can't do that. We've got to do what we can do in our own little way, little by little. And that's all that is called of us. That takes a lot of the pressure off us. It takes a lot of the stress off us in thinking that I've got to do this and that, I've got to do my little bit. If I'm working in a Sunday parish evening ministry, that's my bit. Or if I'm taking tuitions, or I'm helping poor children, or I'm taking care of an ailing parent, or if I work in a hospital, or if I'm helping out in a refugee center, that's all we are called to do. You will have heard of Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS. The Jesuits work with refugees and people who were previously internally displaced. They work with them in 56 countries of the world. Staggering work, 56 countries of the world. But we also know that there are more than 65 million refugees in the world. That's another staggering number. And it's increasing, it's on the rise. This was according to last year's stats. I don't know the latest figures. So it's staggering to think of the number of people who are caught in situations of, where they don't have their own documents. Refugees, internal migrants and migrants across borders. And though the Jesuits work in 56 countries, we touch only 1 in 100 of these refugees in the world. Only 1 out of every 100 we are able to touch in a small way through education, advocacy, life skills, whatever else. So, but that's what we are called to do. We are not called to do everything. We are not the source of all goodness. The source is already there. We are called to mediate some of that in our own little way, in our own capacity. And the third and the last attitude, with that I will stop. A third attitude, very crucial for all of us, is we are all called to be prepared to die. If we are to reflect God's light, we are to be prepared to die. This is an imperative. Die in our own way, in our own daily dying. I think of friends, I have a few friends, families, individual persons in different families who have spent practically their whole lives taking care of, let's say, a special child or a sick parent or an aging parent or someone who's got cancer or terminally ill for years and years. Think of houses that have a special child. The mother sometimes, or sometimes it's a sister, sometimes it is the father, sometimes a brother, who have spent the best part of their lives in one endeavor. That is becoming light unto your brother, your sister, your mother, your spouse, whoever is in the home. That is daily dying. In a little way, we're dying. Sometimes in the family, one has to give up and compromise one's ego for the sake of peace in the house. It happens at broader levels also. Across countries, different countries have to adjust their foreign policy, their financial policies, in order that there be world peace. If all kept attacking each other and doing what they liked, there'd be chaos. We're all called to die to some part of ourselves all the time. And this is also being an illuminating presence in the world. The best image the gospel gives us is of the grain of wheat. Unless the grain of wheat falls and dies, it cannot bear fruit. And once I was asking myself, what if a grain of wheat refused to die? What if that grain of wheat just said, I don't want to die? Different things could happen. It would remain there and then it would get overripe. Maybe the farmer would come and chop it off. Or it would just stay there. When the rains came down, it would wash it off. Or it would get rotten in the mud. Or a bird or a crow might come and eat that grain off and take it. But if it has to create and generate life, it has to die unto itself. This is our invitation too. And on a day like today, we've got a good chance to ask the Lord, what do I need to die to in my own life in order that I and those around me might live in the light of God? Many things we may be called to die to a habit or to an attitude or to a compulsion or a dependency. We ask God for light. That's our prayer. We ask God for light to see what God is calling of me, most of all, today and for the days ahead. Let's pause for a few moments in silence.